and thank you for calling into this webinar about improving the quality of care in aged care. I'm Jess Bowden, a registered dietitian working at the Pure Food Co. A bit of housekeeping before we start. Everyone is muted to prevent noise disruptions. However, there is a chat and question function on your right of your devices. So during this webinar, I'll be explaining a little bit about the theory of continuous improvement, and then we're very lucky to have Julia, Arvida's National Dietitian, to present a case study on the Plan Do Study Act in action. So what is continuous improvement in healthcare? Continuous improvement is about planning and executing initiatives that aim to improve the quality of care that you provide, and through that, the quality of life of residents. It doesn't stop at one project. It's an ongoing approach to achieving excellence. And as new research into best practice emerges, as well as new products and services designed specifically to improve healthcare outcomes, it is widely accepted that change is for the best, especially when it comes to improving the experience in aged care. The Pure Food Co was created from this need, and we will continue to look for new ways in which the food service can support clinical outcomes and resident satisfaction. So hopefully everyone here is here because you agree that change is needed in the ever-evolving landscape of healthcare. But at the core of this change should always be the resident. They should be first and foremost, as they're the people that are receiving this care. Changes in how services are created can do so much to improve happiness for residents, both long-term and with long-term and short-term outcomes. And while there are standards in place to meet requirements of care, and many of those are linked to policy, continuous improvement is slightly different. So what then is the difference between continuous improvement versus a standard to be met? To illustrate the difference, look at the two rooms. The blank room on the left might be meeting all the building code requirements for a room, and it's the exact same room as the one on the right, except the right is a bit more enjoyable to live in. It's got furnishings. It's somewhere that you'd want to come home to. Similarly with a standard versus a continuous, the standards are those minimums that are needed, that are legislated. In New Zealand, the Residential Aged Care Ministry of Health audits, they were introduced in 2002 to assess those standards, with the mid-period surveillance audits added in 2009. These audits were created to measure residential aged care against health and disability services standards. These audits are considered to be a snapshot in time from the available evidence that the auditors have. Therefore, continuous improvements are the steps on top of these minimum standards. And as the New Zealand standards have been updated since 2002, well, in 17 years, there are going to be improvements made to best practice. Hence why in health and disability investigation reports into complaints that have been made by residents or their advocates, the expectation of actions taken is not just looking at the standards published in 2002. The Commissioner will also receive reports from practitioners in the field, in those that have specialisations in those fields, for their feedback on what's considered appropriate action based on the current evidence. And fair enough, residents deserve care that supports the quality of life, and they're actually dependent on the chosen place that they've come to reside to provide for those needs within the available resources. One way of keeping up to date with best practice and the latest initiatives is to sign up to newsletters or follow on social media platforms, the leaders in health and aged care. Here are some of the organisations and platforms that we use to keep up to date. So why not just implement the latest research that you've read about straight away? Well, what works with research doesn't necessarily translate into your site, especially since a lot of the funded research tends to happen in acute public hospitals, which have very different priorities to what you'll be having in a long-term care facility. Also, the resources that were available during a research intervention may differ to what you have available. So you might want to test to see whether or not that piece of research showing an improvement will actually work at your place. or if there's any changes that are needed to be able to embed it. So using evidence to base the types of problems you want to solve and the types of interventions used to solve that problem will support getting the most out of your continuous improvement projects. Sometimes change is implemented because it's part of an updated standard or policy, and those are treated slightly differently. However, for the rest of this webinar, we'll be discussing a framework for testing effective intervention as part of a continuous improvement project. So one reason for continuous improvement projects failing is a lack of robust process for planning, testing effectiveness, and execution. There's a bunch of different types of quality improvement processes, and all of them are appropriate to use at some point of time. Whichever method you do choose to use, the main thing is having a process that supports successful and sustainable interventions that improve the quality within the available resources. Taking part in research studies with universities nearby can help in a number of areas. This is quite a nice way to reduce a bit of that data collection burden as well as analysis. And often with a university research project, they'll include statistics to help definitively prove if the intervention is working. An example of that is Aria Park and Epsom. They were part of the first cohort for a moulding trial with pureed food, and they did that with Massey University students. So they were looking at the total food intake and also resident feedback in comparison of 1 week of unmoulded food and a week of moulded food. And since that project, they've been moulding ever since, and that's an awesome way that they've been able to find have a project that supports resident satisfaction with probably less work than having to design a project on your own. The framework that we'll be going into further is the Plan, Do, Study, Act framework. The aim of using the Plan, Do, Study, Act method for quality improvement is to establish as quickly as possible whether an intervention will work in the setting, as well as establishing the adjustments that need to be made to allow for sustainable intervention. Part of the benefits of using Plan, Do, Study, Act is the flexibility to make changes, which is especially important in healthcare, where there's so many variables that can impact on the success of an intervention. Plan, Do, Study, Act can also be useful for multiple small-scale tests, like looking at a new product for wound healing, which might be only done on 1 or 2 residents. With Plan, Do, Study, Act, it requires adequate time to be spent in each phase of the cycle. The plan stage is similar to the hypothesis stage for research. What do you think will work to solve this problem? It is a very important step that has been identified as a barrier to successful implementation, because a lot of projects can end up having a lack of planning that sets the right expectations, identifies the resources that are required, and establishing realistic goals and time frames. Some of the key components of the planning stage will be discussed next. So what is the problem? In the planning stage, the problem is looking to address needs to be clearly defined, something that will be able to be measured and something that adds value to the residents. There might be a few problems that are being looked at concurrently or in succession. There, unfortunately, is a common misconception in aged care of this is aging, or this is where people are coming to die. However, if you're using benchmarking against other similar facilities, so rest home against best home, that will help support proof that there are many adverse outcomes that can be prevented or minimised, which is why benchmarking to set a higher standard to aspire to can be incredibly beneficial, both with the selection of the problem that you're looking to address and also in the communication to the wider team as to why this problem should be a priority. If the problem is about improved efficiencies, that might be great for your site and for having more time and resources for your team. However, this is unlikely to be seen as an improvement for residents unless you're able to link back to how that's going to improve a resident outcome. For example, more time on the floor might mean more time to have flexibility and choice of when shower. So you've chosen your problem that, if fixed, is going to improve your residents' health or happiness. It now needs to be fleshed out in the project meeting. So who should you have on this team? Studies have shown that interventions are more successful when there's engagement from staff. Engagement is improved with involving staff at all levels and across all levels. This diagram here represents involving both the management and also multiple teams to get the best out of your project. So consider that when selecting those on the project team. Also thinking about who needs to be on that team. For example, if it's around food service, make sure someone from the kitchen team is represented. If it's on falls prevention, then you potentially need your maintenance person there to support measures around the railings and lighting around the facility. During your project meeting, make sure you're listening to the ideas from everyone in the team and also the identified barriers of the frontline staff. If an idea has not been implemented at this time, make sure that it's explained during this project meeting. Otherwise, continued idea sharing might be lost. And this will also help if that team member is then explaining to their co-workers about why this project is important and why this intervention has been chosen. Time barriers and staffing issues are also common themes in aged care. So during those planning discussions, it's important to keep these in mind and come up with solutions that help minimize time. At the end of the project meeting, an action plan is created that includes the intervention and data to be collected. Studies looking into the effectiveness of quality improvement in healthcare found that the complex nature of healthcare means that effective interventions need to be complex and multifaceted. So during planning, all appropriate interventions should be listed, even those not intending to implement in the first cycle. This is very helpful if the desired outcomes are not seen in that first study phase. So that helps you to go back during the meeting minutes to identify if another intervention is more appropriate to do instead of, or to add on top of the initially selected intervention. Interventions should also be able to be seen as something that could be implemented going forward. So just adding staff for a continuous improvement project that won't be there when that project ends is not really going to support full learnings of, will this intervention work long term and can it be embedded? Where that might not be the case is if you're doing data collection just for the project and someone's brought on and does that as just for the data collection aspect to help with the study. Training itself is not important, not an improvement to care, as knowledge doesn't guarantee sustained improvements in care. However, it is a very useful tool to be used for engagement, communication, and compliance to the project, so it can form a very important part of the action plan. So how big do you go? The size of your trial or your project will need to reflect a manageable size for data collection, analysis, and oversight of implementation to ensure that the intervention has been given enough of a chance for outcomes to be seen. There's some issues of some small scale sizes, especially if it's unable to pick up some of the barriers that will be needed to implement study-wide. However, small scales are good when you have a bit of a lack of confidence whether or not the intervention is going to be effective or suitable. Larger scales are good as well, especially if you're fully intending for that intervention to be put in place, but you might be doing the test of the effectiveness of it on just a small subset to reduce that burden of data collection. With Plan, Do, Study, Act, the research has shown that it can be quite useful to tackle a big problem, but in stages. So having multiple cycles to address that one problem, say of falls prevention. So you're looking at different interventions at each step to help address that big problem, but in smaller, manageable ways. So how long to spend on the trial period? Well, that's going to depend on the outcomes you're looking to measure. For example, if you're looking at resident satisfaction, that might be possible to measure after a week. However, something like a reduction in falls will most likely need at least a month. The data collection must be able to inform success within the time period selected. That is why comparing against existing data, audit results, or survey responses supports the comparison of the benchmark and what happens at the end of the study. So it can help with answering that question of, did this work? Ideally, you use existing data to help reduce the burden of data collection. Also consider the appropriateness of the data. With aged care, there's quite a few people with impaired cognitive ability, and those with moderate to severe dementia will be less able to complete a survey on their enjoyment, for example, of food. So a measure you could take would be plate waste, as that would be able to measure their total food intake. The last annual Inter-Eye report stated that 37% of long-term care residents have diagnosed dementia, and that's not including Alzheimer's, which means having a retrospective survey of what happened over the last month or last week might be very difficult for getting accurate resident responses, as they might be basing that survey on that day or their meal that they just had, and can be very difficult for getting a true reflection of the overall satisfaction on a day-to-day basis. When using your data, when selecting the data collection, consider both whether or not it's going to be qualitative or quantitative data. A lot of studies and effective plan, do, study cycles will look at both. So that's both the objective facts and the subjective case studies or anecdotes of increased enjoyment or improvement in skin integrity. At the end of the project meeting, the action plan is set, and when that's put into place, that's the do stage of the cycle. If you're comparing this to a research study, it will be similar to carrying out your research methodology. If the do stage is not done properly, then it's impossible to know if that intervention is successful or not. The do stage is also when learnings are captured. So what are the unforeseen outcomes? How and why did this intervention not work? So ensure that your project team are looking out for these learnings. And it's very important to consider the risk to the resident. Remember, if there's any signs of harm to the resident, it needs to stop, and then an evaluation done to make sure no harm is being done by continuing an intervention. The do stage, the implementation of your intervention, that can be hindered by the communication barrier. So this diagram is showing the communication barrier between a manager who has the full picture and the frontline staff who only have a segment of that puzzle. That communication barrier can impact on the ability for those frontline staff to understand the importance of a project or that initiative. And so they can potentially put up barriers to change and be resistant to change, especially if it results in increased time that it takes for them to do one of the many things they need to do that day. For example, dietitians will always recommend that dessert is given after a meal. The reason for this is that if, as you can see in that picture, if a main meal is given at the same time as the dessert is the thing that's going to be reached for, which will result in the dessert being finished and the main meal being untouched, overall resulting in a decrease in food intake that wouldn't happen otherwise if the main was given first. So the manager might know that. If all that's communicated is don't serve the dessert at the same time, and the callback for why it's important, staff might be less inclined to follow up with that intervention. So helping show the big picture has been shown in research to help support that engagement and success of an intervention. After doing the action plan, it's time to study the data. So has this worked? This part is very similar to the results and discussion of a scientific paper. The goal is to decide, based on the evidence that you've gathered, if the intervention has worked. If there's insufficient evidence, then this should be discussed to support the decision in the act stage as to what the next step should be. During this meeting, you might have a meeting where you are looking at the study, looking at the data. At that time, you might then also look at the act and plan for the next stages. So act. We're now going to make an assumption as to whether or not the interventions that we've been looking at will or will not work for the problem that we're trying to solve. This is acting on the results of the last 3 stages of plan, do, and study. And if deemed of use, we'll either go back through the cycle to start another intervention for that same problem, or if that intervention hasn't been sufficiently embedded and there's not enough evidence to see if it's worthwhile, you might redo that cycle with that same intervention. The other option is, if it looks like that problem is too big to solve or not able to be solved, then stopping that cycle. Remember that the successful plan, do, study, act cycle can mean actually identifying whether or not that. So get yourself up for success. Documentation is a key part of this, especially as it allows for future learnings, especially if there's changes in staff. It also supports continuous improvement at audits and also demonstrating work that you've done in award entries, which will help with the celebration as well as communicating to the rest of the New Zealand aged care market better ways of improving resident outcomes. A Canadian study on the sustainability of interventions after a quality improvement project identified some key learnings. Residential aged care involves complex systems, and therefore collaboration, partnership, and engagement were key factors in areas being able to continue with an intervention over a year after the project had ended. They also found that empowerment and autonomy for frontline workers supported a sustained approach to quality initiatives. So although you might have stopped the cycle, it's important to continue to support the embedding and implementation of your interventions so that they can keep with helping improve resident outcomes. So you can see Julia. So Julia's got a case study from Strathallan, which is an Arvida site in Timaru, which followed the ACT cycle for a project which she'll be explaining in further detail.
Yeah, so hi everyone. As you said, I'm Julia Scott and I work as the National Dietitian for Arvida. So thanks for joining the webinar with us today. So the Pure Foods initiative was developed to maintain and improve weight and nutrition status using natural high protein foods rather than the usual prescribed high energy and protein powdered supplement drinks. The problem that we were looking to solve was firstly managing issues associated with dementia that can cause or are a result of compromised nutrition status. So for example, changes in appetite, swallowing difficulties, alterations in digestion, weight loss, maintaining skin acidity, and so on. And so this, alongside the awareness of the compliance with the traditional head drinks, gave managers at Strathallon the idea of replacing these with pure food desserts to increase intake and therefore protein and energy intake and in turn weight gain. So this was in line with Arvida's aim to meet nutrition requirements through food first and to provide food that is as natural and fresh as possible. So the primary outcome was weight with an initial time frame of 1 month, and the project was developed and implemented by the clinical manager, village manager, with support from the enrolled nurses, caregivers, staff, the GP, and protein from. I think we might have lost you again. Oh, are you back? There we go. So weights were taken using calibrated sit scales and floor wheelchair scales, and were recorded on the eCase weight register, and compliance measured by the food and fluid records.
What was observed during the study phase and what was the action as a result?
So initially the primary outcome was not reached due to a lack of compliance, which was partly due to the absence of the key stakeholder, highlighting the importance of having multiple study leads. So the study was extended to 3 months, and the changes made to increase compliance were the administration of the supplements was given to the enrolled nurses rather than the caregivers, as they were previously the WOUT, the high protein drinks, and also changing from the pure foods desserts as is to a smoothie by mixing them with milk and ice cream, increased resident satisfaction and therefore increased intake. So this was definitely not a perfect randomized controlled trial and had minimal participants. However, there was an overall reduction in weight loss and anecdotal evidence of the improved skin integrity and resident satisfaction, as well as families commenting positively on the initiative. So these benefits do provide promising results of this swap, so much so that the residents have remained on these instead of going back to the traditional high energy and protein drinks. And what was really exciting is that Strathallon at their audit in November gained a CI under the, which is a continuous improvement, under the criteria consumers who have additional or modified nutrition requirements or special diets have these needs met. And the auditors comment that they appreciated the Plan, Do, Study, Act process we had been through and the evidence that this initiative was improving resident outcomes.
That's awesome to hear, especially with the work that went into establish and the evidence behind how to support it, because there's quite a few pieces of evidence around preventative treatment, especially nutrition, which is why we're dietitians, because there's a lot that can be done in the scope of nutrition to support long-term and short-term health outcomes. So it's awesome that the auditors saw that as well during their audit, and it's a great result for Strathallon and Arvida. So just a quick summary of the increased burden of disease and that causing a high complexity of care, that's resulting in an ever increasing need to find new ways in which to do things to support quality of life with the resources that are available, especially when staffing levels can be compromised with those higher acuity levels. So finding more ways negative clinical outcomes from happening, the better, and that by the use of a quality improvement framework can help support that continuous improvement, continuing improvement for quality of care. So thank you everybody for listening. We now can do some question and answers, but we'll also have a follow-up email that includes the continuous improvement guide and hopefully recording of this webinar if it hasn't, if it was able to record the whole thing. So if you've got any questions, can you type it in on the right-hand side of your screens? Okay, so the difference between a quality improvement framework like this and a research study, so Julia touched on it, that case study from Strathallon, it's just a segment of the small population. It's in no way statistically looked at, but that's part of the benefit of using a framework, to use the principles used in science to help test a hypothesis, really, without the stringent work needed to go into it, because to do a full research project that's then published can take years. So it helps with the changing nature in healthcare of being able to quickly address issues and find ways that it works within your site. So Ashley's got a question for Julia. What pure food products were you using in your study?
Yeah, so we were using the Pure Foods desserts. So there's many different options.
Yeah, so there's 6 at the moment.
For example,
plum panna cotta, chocolate brownie, apple pie, butterscotch cake, and passion fruit cheesecake, and berry crumble. But they were being used to make.
Yeah, so milk and ice cream was being added in the second part of the trial, as it was seen that this increased resident satisfaction and therefore intake.
And the whole point of using the pure food desserts is because of the higher protein content. When you're just doing ice cream and cream, it's great for the fat content, but not for the protein. And that's something that's been emerging evidence in aged care with the rates of sarcopenia, which is that muscle loss that occurs, and so muscle loss malnutrition. It is especially an issue for mobility and falls and pressure injuries. So just adding on the fat doesn't mean that you're going to have weights maintained that might look good on paper, but those other health outcomes from not having adequate protein, they're still going to occur. So high fat, high protein are both needed for weight maintenance. So there's a question from Charmaine about where to go for finding out about quality initiatives. So for looking at aged care and quality initiatives, the New Zealand Aged Care Association, they've got their annual conference where they do awards for different categories, and those are quite a good place to look at for all the people that get into the finals, and not just the winners, to see what they're doing, what are the different things that they've tried, because usually to get into being a finalist at those awards, you have to demonstrate the evidence. You have to demonstrate why you chose to do that quality initiative and the proof that it's improved resident outcomes. There's a long way of doing things by going through and searching Ministry of Health audits, but that's quite a time-consuming process. But yeah, I think the best place at the moment would be NZACA. So just, what was Mandy's comment? Okay, so there's a comment about moulding being time consuming. There is a relative amount of time that it takes to mould. With the pure food that we have, we use a citrus fibre to help with stabilising that food, so you don't have to add in extras. So that helps to reduce that process a little bit. Also, because of moulding, you're putting it into a mould and then storing it for later. That can be done in the less busy times of the day, and it also helps with portion control. And also, if a resident doesn't like a certain food, doesn't eat red meat, you can select aspects of the plate that they will eat, and so it helps with supporting resident appropriate meals. There's still a lot of research being done about moulding. So there's whether or not it should be moulded into the shape of the food, or if it should just be some random shapes, or whether or not it's scopes. I think the general consensus is any way to improve the presentation of the plate should be tried and seen what can work. So hopefully, this is an emerging field and more people are taking notice of texture modified meals, as well as the importance for people with dementia to have food that looks good, that they want to eat. So there should be more and more products and services available. So I think someone's typing, but I'll just have a bit of a blurb about malnutrition, which I'm sure Julia will agree with. It's something that happens, it seems to happen quite a bit in aged care. A lot of people coming into aged care at higher acuity levels, so they're more at risk of malnutrition. There's been some interesting New Zealand studies last year done by the team, I think, at Massey University, looking at rates of malnutrition in people entering aged care and also those who are going into the public hospital settings for acute care treatment from aged care. So there is definitely a lot of room for improvement around malnutrition, which is where this has stemmed us doing this focus on continuous improvement. Because really, if you're using a plan, do, study, act cycle or a quality improvement initiative, it's really good to look at ways to prevent those adverse clinical outcomes. So Ashley's commented, which is great, thanks Ashley. For Mercy Hospital room service, food moulding was implemented, and like you said, it was completed in staff downtime and it worked really well. Is there anything you'd like to?
I don't think so.
Cool. So just give you any other questions? Awesome, thanks John. Thank you everybody for your time and also for the questions. Sorry about the issues with the logout. I think we caught it before you missed too much. But if there's anything that you feel like we've missed, feel free to email and we'll include a bit of a summary. But yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you everyone.